During Christmas dinner, my dad raised his glass and said, "To my real son, the one who actually made something of himself." My brother smirked. My mom just nodded. I stayed silent until I slid the deed across the table and watched their faces fall one by one. I, 32M, sat at the far end of the dining table that Christmas Eve, watching the candles flicker against the crystal glasses my mother had insisted on using. The house smelled like roasted turkey and lies. My father stood at the head of the table, wine glass raised, his face flushed with that particular brand of arrogance that came from 3 glasses deep into expensive Cabernet. He cleared his throat dramatically, and I knew what was coming before he even opened his mouth. This was the annual performance, the tradition more reliable than any carol or prayer. My brother sat to his right, straightening his tie and arranging his face into that practiced expression of humble pride. My father announced he wanted to make a toast to his real son, the one who actually made something of himself. The words hung in the air like smoke. My brother's smirk widened just enough for me to catch it. My mother nodded approvingly, her pearl necklace catching the light as she tilted her head toward my brother with maternal adoration. I didn't flinch. I'd stopped flinching years ago. My brother had always been the golden child. Medical school, prestigious residency, partnership in a private practice by 30. My parents loved telling their friends about their son the doctor, conveniently forgetting they had 2 sons whenever it suited the narrative. I'd watched this play out for over a decade. Each year another reminder that I was the consolation prize, the backup plan that never quite measured up. What they didn't know was that I'd stopped caring about measuring up to their yardstick somewhere around my 25th birthday. That was the year I'd started my own business, a small tech startup that everyone told me would fail within 6 months. My father had actually laughed when I told him about it, asking me when I planned to get a real job. My brother had offered his condolences, as if I'd announced a terminal diagnosis. The business didn't fail. It grew slowly at first, then rapidly, then exponentially. By the time I turned 30, I had investors calling me instead of the other way around. By 31, I'd sold a portion of the company for more money than my father had made in his entire legal career. By 32, I was quietly wealthy in a way that didn't require announcements or validation. I'd learned early that my family wasn't interested in my success unless it fit their definition of what success should look like. My brother had the degree, the title, the social standing. I had numbers in bank accounts they couldn't see and didn't ask about. That suited me fine. But sitting there, listening to my father toast my brother for the 10th or 11th year running, something shifted. Maybe it was the way my mother avoided my eyes completely, or the way my brother's girlfriend, who barely knew any of us, joined in the applause like she'd been briefed on her role. Maybe it was just that I was tired of being invisible in a room where I was physically present. I reached into my jacket pocket and felt the edge of the envelope I'd brought with me. The plan had formed weeks ago, during a conversation with my attorney about estate planning and property holdings. I'd been thinking about my future, about legacy, about what really mattered. And I'd realized something that made me laugh out loud in that sterile office. I owned something my parents desperately needed but didn't know they needed yet. My father finished his toast, and everyone drank except me. I set my untouched wine glass down carefully and pulled the envelope from my pocket. The paper whispered against the fabric, a sound that somehow cut through the murmur of conversation that had resumed around the table. I told them I had something to share too, something important. My voice was calm, almost pleasant. My mother looked at me with surprise, as if she'd forgotten I could speak. My father frowned, annoyed at the interruption to his moment. I slid the deed across the table, the heavy paper making a satisfying sound as it glided over the polished wood. It came to rest directly in front of my father, right next to his wine glass. He stared at it with confusion before picking it up. The deed was for their house. The house we were sitting in. The house they'd lived in for 35 years. The house where they'd raised us. The house that held every family dinner and holiday gathering and carefully curated memory. The house they thought they owned free and clear. My father's face went through several colors as he read. Red first, then white, then a grayish shade I'd never seen before. He asked me what this was, what kind of sick joke I was playing. His voice had lost all its earlier confidence. I told him it wasn't a joke. 6 months ago, when the bank had threatened foreclosure after he'd remortgaged the house to cover some bad investments, I'd bought the mortgage. Not through my name directly, but through an LLC, buried under enough corporate layers that he'd never thought to look closely at who actually held the note. I'd been making the payments, keeping them afloat, watching them live in a house they no longer owned while they toasted the son they actually valued. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the candles seemed to stop flickering. My mother's hand went to her throat, fingers catching on her pearls. She asked me if this was true, her voice barely above a whisper. I confirmed it was. Every word documented, every transaction legal and recorded. The house was mine, had been for months. My brother finally found his voice and asked what I wanted, his medical school composure cracking around the edges. The smirk was completely gone now, replaced by something that looked almost like fear. His girlfriend had gone very still, her fork suspended halfway to her mouth. I told them I didn't want anything. That was the truth, and also the lie. I didn't want their approval anymore, didn't want their acknowledgement or their pride. But I wanted them to understand what they'd thrown away, what they'd dismissed while they celebrated the son who fit their vision. My father tried to bluster, told me this was extortion, that I couldn't do this to them. I reminded him that I'd literally been doing it for 6 months while he toasted my brother and ignored my existence. I'd saved them from losing everything, and they hadn't even noticed because they'd never asked, never cared enough to wonder how their mortgage problems had magically resolved themselves. My mother started crying, quiet tears that ran down her cheeks and dripped onto the tablecloth. She asked why I would do this, why I would hurt them like this. The question was so absurd I almost laughed. I asked her when she'd last asked me about my life, about my work, about anything that mattered to me. When had she last looked at me the way she looked at my brother? She had no answer. I explained that I'd made the payments every month, kept their credit intact, protected their retirement. I'd done what family was supposed to do, even when that family had made it clear I was the spare part, the disappointment, the son who hadn't made something of himself. The irony was that I'd made more than any of them, had built something from nothing while they'd celebrated someone who'd followed a well-worn path. My brother tried a different approach, his voice taking on that reasonable doctor tone he probably used with difficult patients. He said we were family, that we needed to work this out, that surely I didn't mean to do this on Christmas. I told him he was right about one thing, we were family, which was exactly why it hurt that they'd never treated me like I belonged to it. The turkey was getting cold. The candles were burning down. My father's wine had left a red ring on the deed where his glass had sat. Nobody was eating anymore. I stood up, straightened my jacket, and told them I'd be in touch after the holidays. My attorney would send over the paperwork they needed to see. They had options, of course. They always had options. But the dynamic had shifted now, and they'd have to acknowledge that shift if they wanted to keep living in the house they'd taken for granted. My mother asked me to stay, to please sit down and talk about this. But I'd been sitting at their table for 32 years, waiting for them to see me. I was done waiting. I walked out through the front door of the house I owned, leaving behind a table full of people who were just beginning to understand what invisible really meant. Update 1. The messages started the next morning. My phone buzzed constantly, texts and calls from my mother, voicemails from my father, even a few from my brother's girlfriend asking if I was okay, which was rich considering she'd been laughing at my father's toast 12 hours earlier. I let them sit unanswered for 3 days while I spent Christmas alone in my apartment, ordering takeout and watching the snow fall over the city. People probably thought that was sad, but it was the most peaceful Christmas I'd had in years. No performances, no comparisons, no sitting in the corner while everyone celebrated someone else. On the 28th, I finally called my attorney and told her to proceed with the next phase. She asked me if I was sure, reminded me that there were bridges I might be burning permanently. I told her some bridges needed to burn. She said she'd handle it. The documents she sent to my parents outlined 3 options. Option 1. They could buy the house back from me at current market value, which had appreciated considerably since my father's original purchase. Option 2. They could continue living there and pay me fair market rent, with a lease agreement that I would honor. Option 3. They could move out within 90 days, and I'd sell the property to a third party. What the documents didn't say, but what was abundantly clear, was that there was no option 4. No free ride, no family discount, no going back to pretending I was the son who didn't matter. My father called me directly after receiving the papers. He was angry, angrier than I'd ever heard him. He called me ungrateful, vindictive, cruel. He said I was destroying the family over hurt feelings, acting like a child. I listened to the entire tirade without interrupting, waiting for him to run out of steam. When he finally paused for breath, I asked him one question. Did he remember my 30th birthday? He went quiet, and I could hear him trying to calculate, trying to remember. He couldn't. I told him that on my 30th birthday, 2 years ago, he and my mother had flown to a medical conference to watch my brother give a keynote speech. I'd invited them to dinner weeks in advance. They'd forgotten completely, hadn't even called. He tried to tell me that wasn't fair, that my brother's career had important moments too, that they'd always loved both of us equally. I told him love wasn't supposed to be a performance review, but that if it was, I'd apparently been failing their metrics my entire adult life. My mother took a different approach. She came to my apartment uninvited, showed up at my door with red eyes and trembling hands. She told me she'd never meant to make me feel less than, that if I felt overlooked it was never intentional. She said family was supposed to forgive each other, that we all made mistakes. I let her in and made her tea, the same kind she'd always served when we were children. I asked her if she knew what my company did, what product we made, or what sector we operated in. She hesitated, then admitted she didn't. I asked if she'd ever asked. She couldn't answer that either. I explained that I wasn't trying to punish her or my father, not really. But I needed them to understand that being family required more than biology and holiday dinners. It required seeing each other, acknowledging each other's existence beyond perfunctory obligations. For decades, I've been a ghost in their house, present but not noticed. She cried and asked what she could do to fix it. I told her that was the wrong question. This wasn't about fixing it. This was about whether they were willing to see reality clearly, to acknowledge what they'd been doing all these years. The house was just a symbol, a piece of paper that made visible what had always been true. They needed me more than they'd realized, and they'd never bothered to notice. Update 2. My brother showed up at my office in January. He bypassed my assistant and walked straight into a meeting I was having with investors. Security started to move toward him, but I waved them off and asked my investors if we could take 15 minutes. They agreed, though several of them looked at my brother with curiosity. Once we were alone in my office, my brother told me I was being unreasonable and that I needed to stop this vendetta. He said our parents were losing sleep, that mom was on anxiety medication, that I was tearing the family apart. He looked tired himself, the golden boy polish worn thin around the edges. I asked him if he'd ever wondered why I never came to his award ceremonies or celebrated his promotions with the same enthusiasm our parents did. He said he'd figured I was jealous. I told him he was half right. I'd been jealous once, but that had faded years ago into something closer to pity. He looked genuinely shocked at that, asked me what I had to pity him for. I explained that he'd built his entire identity on being what our parents wanted, on meeting their expectations and basking in their approval. His whole life was a performance for an audience of two. I'd been forced to find my own way, build my own measures of success, stop caring what anyone else thought. In the end, that freedom had been worth more than any toast. He sat down heavily in the chair across from my desk and asked what I wanted him to do. I told him I didn't want him to do anything. This wasn't about him, not really, though he'd been complicit in it. Every smirk, every knowing look, every time he'd accepted their praise while I sat invisible at the same table, he'd made a choice. Maybe not consciously, but he'd made it nonetheless. He said he'd thought I didn't care, that I'd moved on and built my own life. I told him I had built my own life, but that didn't mean it hadn't hurt. And it definitely didn't mean I owed anyone the pretense that everything was fine. We sat in silence for a while. Finally, he asked if there was any way back from this, any path to being a family again. I told him that depended on what kind of family they wanted to be going forward. The old version, where some people mattered more than others, where success was measured on a single narrow axis, that family was done. If they wanted something different, something real, that was possible. But it would require them to change, not me. He left without another word. Update 3. In March, 3 months after that Christmas dinner, my parents chose option 2. They'd continue living in the house and pay me market rent. The lease agreement was fair, ironclad, and professional. My attorney handled all the paperwork, keeping emotions out of the transaction. My father signed the documents without comment, his signature smaller and less confident than I'd ever seen it. My mother left a note with her signature, telling me she hoped I'd come to Sunday dinner sometime. I didn't respond, but something had shifted, even if it was subtle. My mother started sending me text messages, not the demanding kind from Christmas week, but simple updates. She'd seen an article she thought I'd find interesting. She'd made soup and wondered if I wanted some. She asked about my work, then asked follow-up questions that proved she'd listened to my answers. My father was slower to come around. Pride dies hard in men like him. But in April, I received an email from him, formal, stiff, but genuine. He said he'd been doing a lot of thinking, that he'd never realized how his words had landed. He didn't apologize exactly, but he acknowledged that he'd been unfair, that I'd built something impressive, and he'd been too focused on one definition of success to see it. I didn't answer immediately. I let the email sit for a week, reading it several times, weighing whether the words were just damage control or actual recognition. Eventually, I responded briefly, thanking him for reaching out and telling him I needed time. My brother tried to play mediator, inviting me to family events with carefully neutral language, never pressuring but always extending the option. His girlfriend, surprisingly, sent me an apology for laughing at that dinner. She said she hadn't understood the context, but that she'd seen how it affected me, and she was sorry. I appreciated that more than I expected to. By summer, I'd started attending occasional family dinners again. Not every week, not with any obligation, but when I felt like it. The dynamic was different now. My father no longer made toasts that excluded me. My mother asked about my life with genuine interest. My brother treated me like an equal rather than a disappointment he had to tolerate. It wasn't perfect. Some wounds don't fully heal, and some dynamics leave permanent marks. But it was honest in a way it had never been before. They saw me now, really saw me, and that visibility came at a cost they'd finally acknowledged. I still own the house. The rent payments arrive on the first of each month, always on time. I invest that money into a trust fund I'm building for causes I care about, ways to help people who feel invisible in their own families. Maybe someday I'll transfer the deed back to them, but that day isn't today. For now, I'm content with the truth we've all learned. Respect isn't given automatically, even in families. Sometimes it has to be demanded, and sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to stay invisible, even if the cost is everything you thought you wanted. That Christmas dinner changed all of us. Not because I was cruel, but because I finally refused to be complicit in my own erasure. The deed wasn't revenge. It was a mirror, forcing them to see what they'd been doing all along. And in the end, that was enough.